Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sheila. I work in the Cooling and Energy Efficiency team at C4All, and I will be the moderator of today's session. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's launch of the This is Cool campaign and the Chilling Prospects Tracking Access to Sustainable Cooling 2020 report. Please note that this event is recorded, and the recordings together with the presentation will be shared after the event. And please feel also free to use the Q&A box for any questions you have throughout the presentation, and we will reply to some along the way, but we will have more time to answer more questions at the end of our presentation. You can see here our overview. We will start by presenting our This is Cool campaign and continue then with our findings and the different sections of the Chilling Prospect 2020 report. And these are the presenters today. My colleagues Ben, Alice, and Elwin will be sharing today with you the findings of our tracking work and sustainable cooling solutions. And without wanting to take up any more time, I'll give the floor to my colleague Ben, who will start by giving an overview about our This is Cool campaign. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Shayla. And also, I just want to say a quick thank you to the Cooling for All funders before we get into this. The Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and the Swiss Development Corporation. So without further ado, let's begin. Over the past 2 years, we've made pretty good progress in elevating cooling and access to sustainable cooling as a development climate change issue. We know the scale of the challenge. There are over 1 billion people who lack access to sustainable cooling and over 2 billion that have inefficient cooling. In a warming world, access to sustainable cooling isn't a luxury. So now it's time to focus on the solutions. The This is Cool communications campaign is a solutions-oriented global campaign that will focus squarely on showing what can be done to make sustainable cooling a reality. It's also a partner-driven campaign. Here at SE4All, we'll share our assets and we'll host a website, but we want you to spread the word with hashtag about solutions you know or are working to implement in order to raise awareness of them. The more partners sharing This is Cool content and solutions and using the assets and products that we've developed at SE4All, the better. Those assets include social media content. We have a bank of assets that cross a number of topics, from portable shade to cool schools, urban planning to passive cooling. We want to let images tell the story and start a conversation about the importance of sustainable cooling for all. You can use our graphics and stickers to bring it to life. So, for example, you can take your own photo of a cool solution, add a sticker, and post it using the hashtag. Here are just a few of the examples of social posts in action. I hope you can see the changing screen there on the left-hand side as a building utilizes passive solutions and vegetation, for example. Here's what you can do today. So first, rethink your approach to cooling. Our resources can help you reconsider your cooling choices, help improve lives, reduce emissions, and be more efficient. You can learn why sustainable cooling is so important. And you can spread the word about the campaign. So use our toolkit to do that, but feel free to add your own voice to it. How to access these resources. You can visit our campaign website. It's now live. Here you're going to find case studies, how-to toolkit, social media assets, an image library, and the stickers that I've mentioned before. And don't forget to use the hashtag This is Cool. So I hope you'll all join us. This is a communications campaign that is set to go over the long term. Again, it is very much a partner-driven campaign. So we're going to profile solutions that we know, but we want to hear what yours are too. Please use the hashtag, please use the content, and spread the word through your own social media channels. The more, as I said, the more who are using the This is Cool sticker, hashtag, or assets, the better for us. So I'm now going to move into some of the reasons why cooling solutions are needed in a communication campaign to elevate them or is necessary, and discuss the content of this year's Chilling Prospects report. So like in 2018 and 2019, we're updating the global community on global cooling access gaps. But this year, we took a data and story-driven approach to highlighting the issues as well as the path forward. And so the first thing we'll address today, I think, is a topic that's at the top of many of your minds, COVID-19 and cooling for all. So the first thing we wanted to highlight were the challenges in vaccine delivery before and during the pandemic. By early April already, we know that 13.5 million people in least developed countries had already missed routine vaccinations. By May, 80 million were at risk due to immunization disruption, and over time, 117 million children are at risk of missing a measles vaccine. Of the 10 countries that account for 60% of unvaccinated children, 5 of them are amongst the critical 9 for access to cooling that were identified in the 2018 Chilling Prospects Report. They are Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Brazil. The point here is that there were, are, and will continue to be vast inequities in vaccine distribution globally. And then there is the challenge of delivering a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So just yesterday, in an op-ed in the Washington Post, leaders of Canada, New Zealand, Ethiopia, and Tunisia, among others, said things like, where you live should not determine whether you live, and that the successfully managed vaccine distribution will also be a cornerstone of strengthening multilateralism in the years to come. Well, cold chain is set to be a crucial component of that if a vaccine is needed and it is not thermostable. We know that most influenza-type vaccines require cold storage. But the issue becomes more significant if it requires storage at -80, as almost half of the vaccine candidates in phase 1 or later trials do. With the situation as is in terms of cold chain, they require a new cold chain for much of the developing world. Issues like energy access compound the problem, as well as communications efforts that vaccine campaigns typically rely on. But the issue of vaccines is not the only one that touches cooling for all by virtue of the pandemic. Another is nutritional preferences and malnourishment. We see that some nutritional preferences in Asia in particular are changing in favor of fresh food that require a cold chain. But at the same time, the economic effect of the pandemic is predicted to have a profound effect on malnutrition, with many opting instead for cheaper, high-calorie foods that don't necessarily require refrigeration. Another is finding social distance in a hot slum, something that, when you think about it, can be very, very challenging. So consider Delhi, where temperatures were above 40 at the height of the pandemic stages. To find social distance in a slum, you don't have access to cooling. There's one community cooling resource that might be able to. Challenges are fairly evident. And we know that many who are vulnerable to heat stress are also vulnerable to COVID-19. So the next issue I'll touch on is one that we've described as the productivity penalty of failing to deliver cooling for all. It will be developing countries that face the most significant penalties, with women, outdoor workers, and migrant workers particularly at risk. So thanks to an ILO study last year, we know the potential job impact of heat stress in 2030. And we know that almost all of those jobs, 73.7 million of them out of 80 million, will be lost in the high impact countries for access to cooling. In the critical 9, again, those are 57.6 million jobs. And as a reminder for our listeners who may not have seen earlier reports, the critical 9 countries for access to cooling are India, China, Indonesia, Pakistan, Mozambique, Brazil, Bangladesh, Sudan, and Nigeria. Those critical 9 are among a total of 54 high-impact countries for access to cooling. So, SE for All, in this year's report, we can now estimate the current annual economic loss due to heat stress in those 54 high-impact countries at $630 billion annually already. $517.5 billion of that loss is coming in the critical 9 that I just mentioned. Of the 630 billion, 301 billion is lost in the agricultural sector, which is an economic driver for much of the developing world. Here we've picked out the case study of Nigeria and the agricultural sector to demonstrate why this is important. So of course, Nigeria relies heavily on agriculture for its GDP. Many of its farmers are smallhold, and 31% of rural Nigerians who make up the bulk of those smallhold farmers, only 31%, excuse me, have access to basic electricity services. And so we have about 3.36% annual productivity loss in Nigeria due to this. So and with the data that we have from the FAO, we can see that the proportion of crops sold through local or informal channels makes it clear that a lack of access to cooling, both in terms of electrical cooling solutions that would power agriculture, and as well in terms of markets, is really holding the Nigerian sector back. So with that, I've presented 2 of our top stories for Cooling for All, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Alice to give you a sense of what the global picture looks like for Cooling for All.
So I was also saying the Chilean prospect identifies a set of 4 different groups who are population at risk. And I will now present the global trends that we have identified for this year. So just a quick reminder that of those different group of population at risk. We have the rural poor. Those are, as you can see here, are living in a rural area. They are likely to be subsistence farmers without access to an intact cold chain to handle their agricultural products, and they may also lack access to electricity and not being properly stored vaccines. The next group is the urban poor. These may have some access to electricity but live in housing of poor quality. They also may have a refrigerator, but food often spoils due to intermittent power. The next group are the lower middle income. This group may purchase an affordable, thus likely an efficient air conditioner or refrigerator that raise energy consumption and greenhouse gas emission. The last group, these are the middle income. They may be able to afford a more efficient air conditioner and minimize its use. And they may also be able to move to energy efficient housing and working environment. So these are the 4 groups that we identify and that we work with the Chilean prospect. So we also have identified a set of a risk spectrum that we also utilize just to show how these people, these 4 groups are represented. So on the high risk, these are the people, population with no access to electricity, income below poverty line, poor ventilation and construction. They might not have the best housing solutions. They might not have access to refrigeration for food. The farmers may lack access to controlled cold chain, and the vaccines exposed to might be exposed to high temperatures. So all of these criteria do put certain population, if they experience these criteria, they might be in a higher risk to not having access to cooling. The next risk group is the medium risk. So this is having access to electricity, having lower income levels, ability to run a fan, have access to buildings constructed to older standards. The foods, they might have food that is refrigerated. The farmers have access to intermittent reliable cold chains, and vaccines may have exposure to occasional high temperatures. So these are the medium risk. And the low risk at the end is having a full and stable access to electricity, middle income or higher, well-built home, which can also include insulation, passive design, or air conditioning. Food is refrigerated reliably, and farmers have goods and vaccines that are on the well-controlled cold chain. So as you can see, these are the risk spectrum that we utilize. And if you remember also the four groups that I presented just a few minutes ago, you can see that the urban poor and the rural poor are in the highest or are at highest at risk. So I would now go through those four groups just to show exactly the trends and the key findings for those. So for the rural poor, for 2020, we have approximately 318 million population. These are population at highest at risk. So the rural poor, again, these are likely to be subsistence farmers without access to inter-cold chain, and then they lack access to electricity and properly stored vaccines. As you can see, there is a slight or a decrease of rural poor population, about 40 million since last year. But as you can see, from 2018 to 2020, there is a decreasing trend in this population. This can be, this is significant. This is due to significant increase in rural energy access that can provide energy for fans and refrigerators. This is also a positive trend in electrification with major improvement in India that is driving some of this trend. Also, it's important to note that there's an increased vulnerability in some countries, especially Bangladesh and Angola. We have here a map showing the distribution of this population. So as you can see, this is mostly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So moving now to the next to the urban poor. Here again, urban poor is a population that may have some access to electricity, but live in housing of poor quality. They may have a refrigerator, but food often spoils due to intermittent power. Here, there is a increasing trend of this population. This can be due to continued urbanization in fast-growing cities in Asia and in Africa. There's also an alarming trend in countries where more than 50% of urban population is at risk. These are especially countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Yemen. As you can see on the map as well, the concentration is higher in Asia and Latin America, with some spots in sub-Saharan Africa. So we move forward to the next group. So we also have a population which is in another type of risk. This is population at medium risk. So we have 2.2 billion people with at lower income. So these are people who may purchase an affordable, thus likely inefficient conditioner or refrigerator that raises energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Here, the trend is also a decreasing one with 26 million decrease from since last year. This could be, so these people also have a risk of purchasing less sustainable cooling devices associated with income growth and lower prices for entry-level units. As you can see from the map, this is mostly, again, more of an Asian story, but there are some spots as well on the African continent. So we move forward to the last group, the middle income. Here we have approximately 1.4 billion people. So these are population who are at low risk, so meaning that they may be able to afford a more efficient air conditioner or minimize its use, and they may also be able to move to energy efficient housing and working environments. Here we have an increase of 97 million people, and you can see on the map that the distribution is mostly concentrated in Asia. So this population have increased purchasing power and growth of an established middle class. And also it's important to note that the COVID-19 may challenge purchasing power in the future. So this is something that it's important to note and maybe also keep an eye on going forward with tracking the numbers. So we have, this is just an overall view of the four groups, the trends and tracking their movements. But we also went and done a 3-year analysis since we started tracking this number, just to see what type of trends we can find. So we have here for Asian countries and Middle East, as you can see, overall there is a decrease in number. And you can see as well the blue part of the chart represent the lower middle income, and the red one are the urban poor, and the green the rural poor. So here, really the Asian countries and Middle East countries, that's where you will find a big chunk of the lower middle income. This is for the lower middle income, there's a decrease happening, while there is a slight increase in the urban poor. On the next slide, there is a bit of we've done also just an analysis just to see what's behind this increase. So there is diverging pathways specifically for China and India, who are driving those trends that we saw in the previous slide. For China, there is an income increase plus an increase as well in the sales of devices such as air conditioning. These income and these sales are growing, and because of that, the lower middle income actually is starting to decrease. You can also see that China has is decreasing at a faster rate. So you can see China this is the chart in red. And for India, we have more people going out of poverty. So this is also driving. This represents really millions of people who will be able to purchase very soon a cooling device, which also will be representing a different type of challenges when it comes to grid electrification and providing efficient devices. So if we move to next slide, we can see the trends, 3-year trends for countries in Africa. Here you can see that there is a slight increase of the overall population at risk. And compared to Asia, on the other hand, you can see here that the largest population at risk or group here is the rural poor, with the lower middle income starting to grow a little bit, but not as fast as we saw earlier in the Asian countries. The urban poor are slightly increasing as well, but this is overall a slight increase in the trends, 3-year trends for the African countries. On the next slide, you can see a map representing the African countries most at risk. Here you can see that of the African countries identified by high impact, 10 still have 60% of their population at highest risk. This you can see is Angola, Benin, Burkina Faso, Djibouti, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Malawi, Mali, Mozambique, and Togo. And you remember, as Ben mentioned earlier, Mozambique is one of the nine critical countries for cooling. On the overall, the high impact countries in Africa, 45% of the total population are categorized as high risk. So you can see there is really Africa is really representing a different group of risk here. They do have higher population at risk, and this is also something to keep in mind while going forward. For the next slide, there is a 3-year trend for Latin America and the Caribbean. You can see here there is more or less a consistent growth. There isn't any major, there aren't that a major growth, but you will see that the population at risk here are mostly lower middle income and urban poor. The rural poor are not as high as we saw in Africa or in Asia, and the growth isn't really as strong overall as the other two regions. So for the next slide, if there are three things we should remember from this global trend, is that really 1.02 billion people remain at highest risk overall globally, compared to 1.05 in 2019 and 1.1 billion in 2018. There is a slight decrease, but again, there are still a lot of people remaining at highest risk overall. It's also important to remember that while energy access lowers risk exposure, it does not necessarily imply enhanced access to cooling. And the last thing is that the changes in volume do not necessarily imply a transition from one population at risk to another. I also just want to before passing the baton to my colleague Alvin, to remind everyone or to tell everyone that we have a deeper analysis in our report, which is now online, where we have a 10-year trend is one of the annexes, which I would really encourage everyone to go look at it and really give a bit broader sense of what the different trends are. So we now pass the baton to Alvin, who will be explaining India case studies to showcase what these global trends or what the numbers that we have for India. Alvin, to you.
Thank you, Alice. So next slide, please. For this year, what we thought is that as we are looking at the changing global trends, we tried to also assess when we look at large markets, especially a country like India, which has a large population, diverse geographies and climate. It will be interesting to see how the lack of access to cooling risks would play out at the subnational levels. So based on that, this year what we try to do is that look at how to categorize the risks at state level, and then maybe that can be used as a way that policymakers can prioritize state level actions. To begin with, we see that in India, pretty much the sales for ACs is linked with the growing income trends. Over the past 2-3 years, we have seen that there's a decrease in the number of rural poor and a slight increase in the number of urban poor, where actually in the last 2 years, the urban poor has actually increased significantly. What that essentially means is that although the rural poor who may not have access to electricity and in turn not have access to cooling, and that has essentially shifted to the urban poor, although they might have some access to electricity, but they might be also not having access to an cooling appliance or other forms of cooling. So they are still at high levels of risk. And then we see that in the past 4 or 5 years, there's a steady growth in the number of people in the lower middle income, which essentially shows that there would be a higher demand in the future for cooling appliances. It could be an AC, it could be just fans or evaporative cooling, but it would go to a place where these appliances in the future would have to be at some level efficient, and how we address the cooling issues has to be sustainable. Next slide, please. So when we looked at India, and first we looked at the cooling degree days, and as you can see on the India map that you see on the left-hand side, though there are certain states which have higher cooling degree days, there are certain states that have comparative lesser cooling degree days, but they have higher temperatures. So it is very important to actually look at cooling degree days and the peak temperatures together to have an overall assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities that people have in those places. So I can take you through an example. is if you look at the graph on right-hand side, for the peak summer months in India are April, May, and June. And you can see that the average temperatures in June for Delhi is around 40, and for Hyderabad is around 35. But if you look at the peak temperatures, in Delhi it can actually reach around 48, and actually Hyderabad is pretty close, which is around 45. So though when you compare the CDDs between Delhi and Hyderabad, they might have a different story to tell, but in terms of risks, they are pretty much in the same basket. So this is very interesting to look at. And also we have seen that there has been an increase in the number of deaths due to heat wave incidents from 90s to mid of till 2015. And then we expect through our studies and research is that there would be an estimated 42% increase in CDD by the end of the century. So this calls for a lot of focus at state level and how risks are to be assessed. And as of now, we see that only 10% of the households in India have an AC unit, and the rest 8% would have some form of cooling system. Next slide, please. So to do this, this is a first kind of an exercise that we tried to do, and for this we had a methodology that we tried to first look at categorizing or listing the states based on their income per capita or per day, and look at the average maximum temperatures and also the cooling degree days average in the past 4 to 5 years. And based on that, what we essentially made was three bins: high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And as you can see, the high risk is which states that have income per capita income of less than $1.9 a day, have an average maximum temperature of above 35 degrees Celsius, and a CDD of about 1,900. Similarly, for medium risk, it will be around between $1.9 to $5.5 per day, and a temperature bin of 35 to 25 degrees, and CDD between 1,900 and 1,000. And anything above 5.5 is in a low risk of dollars per day. The average maximum temperature below 25 degrees, and CDD below 1,000. So based on this, first these initial criteria, we tried to list the states and union territories of India. And we saw that whichever states met at least two of the high risk categories, they were considered as high risk. And then medium risk and low risk. And then we tried to adjust these rankings based on the ownership of cooling appliances in these states, and to assess the overall vulnerability. Next slide, please. So based on our assessment, and this is to basically say that we have only actually, for this particular study, we have, although India has 28 states and 8 union territories, but for our study, we have only taken 28 states and 2 union territories because of data constraints. So based on the scope of the study, we found that 14 states in India that is home to almost above 800 million people are at high risk. 9 states that have over 300 million people are at medium risk, and around 7 states that are home to around 27 million people are at low risk. And within the high risk, we see that the states Bihar, Jharkhand, and Uttar Pradesh are at the highest risk in terms of their appliance ownerships, the temperature ranges that they face, and also the income levels. Next slide, please. So once we saw this, and it will be a kind of an interesting way to look at it also, because India has recently launched its National Cooling Action Plan. And we thought that maybe it would be good that at state level actions can be prioritized based on this. And then we, for this year, we were trying to launch a discussion around what are the sustainable cooling solutions, because we want to essentially look at cooling at a more holistic view. And so we came up with a framework which we intend to discuss with our partners in the future, and of course, put a procedure around it and elaborate it. Next slide, please. So, yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. So this framework essentially has the first pillar, which is the cooling for all needs assessment, which was, if you remember, was launched at the last year's MOP, and where we identified three main areas which was comfort and safety, food and nutrition, and health and care. And then if you look on the right-hand side, we look at four main pillars of solutions, which are technology, services, policy, and finance. But in between, if you see, we thought that to make a journey from assessing the cooling needs of a country and then going towards a solutions pillar, it is really important to have 5 main approaches to optimize each and different types of needs to the type of solutions that we have. So that is why we, in addition to what the Cool Coalition has, which is move, shift, and improve, we also try to address vulnerable population and affordability for cooling solutions in protect, and then of course reduce, shift, improve, and leverage. I'll go into a bit more into detail of these things, but this is the overall framework that we are looking at to discuss with our partners in the future. Next slide, please. So the first pillar which we discussed was the cooling for all needs, and it was introduced last year as well. And under the comfort and safety, we basically look at human comfort, productivity, and safety. So we do see that people who are living in built environments, they also work in workplaces which require safe cooling for productivity, and also aspects related to extreme weather and safety. So this is something that we looked at. Then, of course, the next big chunk is cold chains, and but how to really look at cold chains would be through a more sustainable development goal angle of food, nutrition, and food security. And the last one would be, which is very important at this point as we are in our world right now, is health and care. So these are the 3 main pillars. And how we would like policymakers to think their cooling needs is not from a cut and dry energy and emissions point of view, but more from a sustainable development goals point of view. Next slide, please. So as I said, then to look at this, then we have 5 optimizers. First is protect, where we look at the affordability, safety, reliability. Next slide, please. Next section, yeah. Then we look at reduce, where we try to reduce reliance on mechanical cooling as much as possible. We want to promote passive cooling in new urban cities, green design in new buildings, and more nature-based approach, where we would like to reduce dependency on mechanical cooling and other active forms. Next one, please. And of course, the world that we know right now has a lot of active systems around based on which how we meet our cooling needs. So for them, we propose a shift basically through 3 areas, that is system type, refrigerants, and energy source. So if it is a system, we try to increase its efficiency. Refrigerants move into more climate-friendly refrigerants, and energy source move into more clean energy sources. Next one, please. And then the systems that we have right now, they have we have to make sure that, of course, there would be still reliance on active cooling and mechanical cooling solutions. So it is important that their efficiencies are improved and their operational efficiencies are also taken care of, because once these systems are put in, they are there for 5 to 10 years in most of the countries. So we have to make sure that their operational efficiencies are also looked at. Next one, please. And finally, to make sure that to bring this all together, that we leverage the different partnerships, the different kind of stakeholders, and to make a more collective impact. And this is very important because we feel that this is the only way that a holistic, sustainable solution approach can be brought in. So it is very important to bring all types of stakeholders together and partners to make a more collective impact. Next slide, please. And then the final one is the 4 main solutions pillars, but I will, because of time constraints, I'll just quickly go through them. Essentially, we have technology, services, policy, and financial, where, next slide, please. Where technology is basically, we have tried to split it into 2 parts. One is passive and nature-based technology solutions. Try to go back to more indigenous, low-tech, and modern high-tech solutions as well, which are not, emissions and energy intensive. And then if you look at the optimizers on the right-hand side, for each type of solutions, we think that which is the main optimizer which will come into play. So for example, affordability and reduce, and shift and reduce. Next slide, please. Then, of course, we have to look at the active technologies as well. And as I discussed earlier, we are looking at the 3 main under the active technology, which is device efficiency, refrigerant type, and energy source. And you can look at the optimizers. It's mostly to improve, shift, and to bring towards leveraging collective partnerships. Next slide, please. In services, we have basically split up into 3 main parts. One is preparational, 2 main parts. One is preparational and operational. In preparational, this is one of the main areas where a lot of the Montreal Protocol community is already deeply involved with, which is education, skills development of the servicing sector. And then we think that project services like analysis, modeling, and quality assurance would be an important aspect as well to making decisions on sustainable cooling. Next slide, please. And then we look into the operational aspects, which is essentially the one is the operation, which is the more technical side and management of these solutions, and then the maintenance. Next slide, please. Then we look into the policies. The policies have been basically subdivided into 3 main areas. One is regulations, and this is pretty much self-explanatory, which is trying to put into regulations that can shift shift the market and technology towards more climate-friendly and sustainable solutions. Next slide, please. Then we look at information policies. This is mostly to deal with policies that will make end users more aware of the type of solutions that they can access to, and then provide an incentive structure around it. Next slide, please. So as I said previously, based on the information policies that we have, we'll have to set up some incentive structures, and then we look at that as 2 main aspects. One is non-financial and financial. Non-financials are essentially providing more support to sustainable cooling solutions in terms of permits and approvals, so that they are more marketable. And next is the financial ones, where essentially they need the market capital to reach a more wider uptake. Next slide, please. And then in the finance, we have tried to break it up into three main parts. Finance is the traditional bin of solutions like loans, risk sharing, contracts. But for each of them, we think that there are certain optimizers which we need to think of. So, which I'll come back to in one of the slides. Next slide, please. Again, the fiscal one is the second one for financial, where we are looking at energy pricing, tax credits. Most of them are basically governments trying to influence decisions, and which will be based on some kind of government expenditure, but it will have a larger impact for these kind of solutions. Next slide, please. And then the final one is grant and rebates. And then we feel that in most of the grants, rebates, and subsidies, there is a need to look into the affordability, the vulnerability, and people-centric aspect as well. Next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, to how to look at the optimizer. So if you can see the one which is highlighted in green, if we pick one of our regulatory policies, which is that we are prescribing as the utility obligations, is where the utilities, which are the power providers, essentially set up, are required to support sustainable cooling and have specific targets to meet. And within those kind of regulations, it is important that the affordability, the shift, improvement, and reduction optimizers are looked at for reaching the overall objectives of the utility obligations. And it is not just simply looked at as a megawatt saved. And then also because it requires an overall stakeholder buy-in, and we think that the leverage optimizer is also very important. Next slide, please. So basically now, through this exercise, in the coming months, we will be discussing with our partners towards developing a solutions assessments toolkit, and basically having a procedure around all of these pillars that we have and the framework that we have discussed. And to give a bit more, to tie this one a bit more into how we are going to now create awareness around this through our This Is Cool campaign, I'll request my colleague Ben to take the baton from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alvin, who's coming to us from Bangkok. Much appreciated. So with that sort of summary of what the content is from Chilling Prospects 2020, and as put by Alvin, the focus on the solutions and the solutions toolkit, we wanted to round out this presentation with a reminder about the This Is Cool campaign. Again, I think, from our perspective here at SE for All, now is the time to focus on solutions, and this campaign is intended to do just that. We want you to participate. We want you to show us what solutions you know and are aware of, and help us spread the word. So those simple actions you can take: rethinking your approach, learning why sustainable cooling is important, and spreading the word, are things we hope you'll do. And we hope that you'll visit thisiscool.seforall.org to pick up some of the assets and learn how you can utilize the campaign. So thanks very much. We hope that this will be a great success, but we are relying on your participation and the solutions that you can bring out. So with that, I'll pass the microphone back to my colleague Shayla, after quickly, again, thanking our funders and supporters, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, ClimateWorks, among others, who fund sustainable energy for all.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thank you everyone for the questions. Please feel free to write also any additional questions to me through the Q&A box. But please do also not hesitate to email us at coolingforall@c4all.org should you have any more questions at a later stage. So I guess we can start with the first question, which is aimed, I think, at Ben. The first question is, do you estimate that the positive achievements in terms of access to cooling, especially for rural poor and for lower middle class, might be reversed again as a result of the COVID crisis?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think the answer is in all likelihood yes. For the rural poor, I think we know that there's going to be an enormous impact in terms of availability of vaccines, simply because of what's already occurred in the vaccine cold chain for regular vaccines. The question as to whether or not a COVID-19 vaccine becomes available and if it requires cooling is set to add to that pressure. I think where we can see it explicitly for the rural poor is these issues of nutrition. I think the 2008 food price crisis caused a significant increase in malnutrition. I think we're starting to see that again. And I think the extent to which that is linked to nutritious goods that requires cooling is fairly clear, although we are yet, I think, in general, to see what the full consequences of the pandemic are. We also, I think evidence of that is the fact that, we saw some early estimates from the World Bank in terms of the millions of people that would be forced into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And by poverty, I mean living below $1.90 US a day, that were around 40 to 50. And those have been revised to a best case scenario of 70 to a worst case scenario of 100 million people who are forced into poverty due to the pandemic. So I would expect that would have a profound impact on access to cooling among the rural poor. And we would see the results not only next year, but over the next few years. On the lower middle income, I think this is certainly a story about social safety nets and people's purchasing power parity and their economic decisions with more limited resources. So I think, again, the answer is yes. In all likelihood, yes, we expect to see some gains reversed, simply because this will force people to make hard choices with their funds, and picking up a cooling device may not be the first thing that they want to do. So yeah, I think the general answer is in all likelihood, yes.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I think the next question goes to Alice. Alice, what are the plans to deeper analysis with other countries?
Thank you. That's a good question. So we work with governments and initiatives, supporting them with their national cooling action plans. We also work with governments for the NDC enhancements, and also how to support them leveraging commitments and policy to deliver sustainable cooling. But if you have more specific questions about which government and which one we will be able to do more tracking, please do contact us. We are always willing to get insights and on how to best collaborate with others. So please do get in touch with us if you have more questions about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I think we have a bit more time for one last question. I think this could go as well to Ben, but please feel free to anyone. For This Is Cool, how long will the campaign run, and how will you be tracking it? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'll go very quickly because I know we want to wrap up very, very fast. How long will the campaign run? This campaign, This Is Cool, will run over the long term. This is not just about this week, the next month. This is about the next year and a half, 2 years, that we want to be able to profile sustainable cooling solutions. How it will be tracked? Periodically, SE4All will be reviewing what's been shared by the partners, and profiling those things through our own social media channels. So this will be ongoing. The communications campaign will be ongoing. And maybe as a final plug, we hope you'll participate and share your solutions. We're really looking forward to them.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank everyone who participated today. And again, thank you to all of our funders and supporters. Please feel free to email us. We will make sure to send you the presentation and the recording of this presentation. Thanks a lot and goodbye.